Caleb Johnson never thought a simple flight to Atlanta could turn into a test of patience and dignity. It was just another spring break trip. At least that's what he told himself when his mom handed him the boarding pass. The early April sun streamed through the car windows as Alicia Johnson pulled into the departure lane at JFK International Airport. She eased the sedan up to the curb, hazard lights blinking, and gave her son one of those last-minute mom glances, a quick scan to make sure nothing was out of place. "You've got your ID?" she asked. Caleb patted the front pocket of his jacket. "Driver's permit and school ID, just like you said." "And your tablet?" "Right here," he said, tapping his backpack. Alicia smiled and handed him the boarding pass. "Remember, gate B31, first class. You board early, so don't wander off too far. Dad's waiting in Atlanta." JFK was buzzing with spring break travelers, families with strollers, college students with backpacks and flip-flops, business people in suits weaving through the crowd. Caleb slipped his backpack over his shoulder, adjusted his baseball cap, and stepped onto the sidewalk. Inside the terminal, he followed the signs to the Delta check-in counter. A Sky Club attendant noticed his first-class ticket and offered to walk him through the expedited security lane. Caleb thanked her, and when she helped with his bag, he slid a folded $5 bill onto the counter without a second thought. She smiled and said, "Sweet kid, safe travels, hun." The Sky Club at JFK was warm and quiet, a world away from the bustle outside. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a view of taxiing planes. The air smelled faintly of brewed coffee and cinnamon pastries. Caleb poured himself a glass of orange juice and found a seat near the window. He watched a Boeing 757 roll toward the runway, wondering if it was headed somewhere tropical, when the announcement came over the lounge speakers. "Flight DL-145 to Atlanta, boarding in 20 minutes at gate B31. He packed up, tossed his cup in the bin, and made his way to the gate. That's when he noticed her. Linda Harper was hard to miss. Mid-50s, platinum blonde hair in a neat bob, tailored navy blazer, diamond stud earrings catching the light. She stood with one hand on the handle of a designer carry-on, the other holding a phone, eyes darting toward him. Caleb felt the faintest ripple of awareness, like being studied by a substitute teacher who didn't trust the seating chart. When the gate agent announced boarding for first class, Caleb stepped forward. Linda moved too, her heels clicking on the polished floor. He offered a polite nod as they reached the scanner, but she didn't return it. On board, the first-class cabin was calm. Soft leather seats, wide armrests, the faint scent of lemon-scented cleaning wipes. Caleb found seat 3A by the window. He stowed his backpack carefully overhead, slid into the seat, and exhaled. The pre-flight bustle filled the space, overhead bins opening and closing, flight attendants greeting passengers by name. Linda arrived a moment later, sliding into 3B beside him. She offered a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Morning," she said before turning to tuck her bag under the seat in front of her. Caleb returned the greeting, then pulled out his tablet to read. The screen glowed softly in the dim cabin light. A flight attendant named Megan Carter stopped by with a tray. "Pre-flight drinks? Orange juice? Sparkling water? Or champagne?" "Orange juice, please," Caleb said. "Champagne," Linda replied, her tone crisp. Then, leaning subtly toward Megan, she added in a low voice, "Could you check the seating chart for a moment?" Caleb caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. Megan glanced at him briefly before offering a professional smile and moving toward the galley. The hum of boarding continued. Passengers in the back filed past, some glancing into first class with a mix of curiosity and envy. Caleb sipped his juice, feeling the faintest knot form in his stomach. He'd flown plenty of times before, but this felt different. He set the cup down and looked out the window, watching a baggage cart trundle past. Behind him, a couple in their 60s discussed their connecting flight. Linda leaned slightly in his direction. "Traveling alone?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said politely. "Interesting," she murmured, almost to herself. The captain's voice came over the PA, welcoming passengers aboard and giving the weather in Atlanta, a mild 72 degrees. Megan returned, checking seatbelts and carry-ons. As she reached their row, she offered Caleb a polite, almost apologetic smile. Caleb noticed Megan, the flight attendant, looking at his boarding pass with a puzzled expression. "Excuse me, young man, are you sure you're in the right seat?" Linda's voice cut through the hum of boarding passengers. The question hung there like a cold draft. Caleb glanced up from his tablet, surprised by how quickly the polite veneer had dropped. The aisle behind them was still a parade of rolling suitcases and winter coats looped over arms. People slowed just a half step, enough to hear, but not enough to look like they were eavesdropping. "Yes, ma'am," he said evenly. "Seat 3A. He tapped the headrest label with a calm finger. "Same as my boarding pass." Linda's smile was pleasant in the way a no trespassing sign tries to be neighborly. "Of course. It happens all the time," she said. "Sometimes kids sit down where they don't mean to in all the rush." Megan, the flight attendant, reappeared with a practiced smile and a handheld scanner. "Everything okay here?" "Could you just verify his seat?" Linda asked, keeping her voice light but pitched to carry. "I'm sure he's fine, but I like things in order." Megan accepted Caleb's boarding pass. Her eyes flicked between the screen and the ticket. "Caleb Johnson, 3A. You're perfectly placed, sir." She handed it back and gave him a small nod that said, "Sorry you had to deal with that without using words." "Wonderful," Linda said, already pivoting. "And, Megan, do you have a list of the meal options? I have a gluten sensitivity and a delicate stomach." "Absolutely. We've got a grilled chicken salad and a quinoa bowl today. I can note your allergy." Megan moved on, her smile tightening as the aisle pressed with more bodies. Caleb refocused on his screen, but the words of his e-textbook swam. He could feel Linda's gaze skimming over his hoodie, his earbuds case, his shoes, taking inventory like a boutique clerk suspecting a shoplifter. He'd hoped for a quiet flight, chapter outlines for biology, an episode of a space documentary he liked, maybe a nap. Nothing dramatic. A man across the aisle cleared his throat. He was in his late 60s, silver hair combed tidily, wire-rimmed glasses perched low. He lifted his paper cup of coffee in Caleb's direction, a tiny toast. The gesture was so ordinary and kind that the knot in Caleb's chest loosened a notch. "Traveling alone?" Linda asked again, as if the answer might have changed in the last 90 seconds. "Yes, ma'am." Caleb kept his tone polite. His mom's voice floated through his head. "Keep calm, keep your answers short, and don't give strangers your whole life story." Linda made a small humming sound. "Where are your parents meeting you in Atlanta?" He thought about ignoring that one, then decided a soft pivot was safer. "My aunt's picking me up," he said, which was true for many holidays, if not this trip. "It's spring break." "It is," Linda said, and turned to pull a leather folio from her tote. "Schools these days have such generous vacations." She opened the folio with slow, deliberate care, like a judge opening a sealed file. Boarding continued. Overhead bins thunked shut. A toddler in economy behind them squealed in delight at something on a tablet, and someone farther back laughed at the contagious joy of it. Megan passed again with a basket of snacks and bottled water. "Anything I can get for you before we push back?" she asked their row. "Sparkling water, please," Caleb said. "Champagne refill," Linda added, tilting her glass. "And could you ensure the overhead bin is properly secured? I get nervous about things falling." She glanced up toward where Caleb's backpack sat in the bin, as if the mere mention could make it tumble. Megan's smile flattened a fraction. "Of course." She touched the latch, it was already locked, and moved on. Caleb sipped his water. The bubbles tickled his tongue. He tried to tune himself to the rhythms of the plane, the pre-flight checklist murmurs from the galley, the soft whoosh of the air vents, the faint scent of citrus cleaner and brewed coffee. It helped. It always did. He felt the shift when Linda leaned closer, not quite close enough to invade, but close enough to command attention. "What grade are you in?" "Ninth," he said. She scanned his tablet. "That's quite an advanced text." "It's interesting," he replied. "Simple, true." He thought about telling her how his dad once took him out to the observation deck at Hartsfield-Jackson to watch the heavies climb, how the ground shook, how he started keeping a notebook of aircraft silhouettes. He decided to keep that to himself. Not every person earned your stories. Across the aisle, a woman in her 70s slipped off her silk scarf and folded it carefully into her lap. She had calm, intelligent eyes and the sort of posture that suggested a lifetime of classrooms. She offered Caleb a warm glance. "Aerospace?" she asked, voice low and friendly. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Good field," she said. "I'm Evelyn, physics retired." The corners of her mouth quirked. "Retired from the paycheck, not the curiosity." "Nice to meet you," he said, the gratitude he felt probably more obvious than he intended. Linda slid her folio shut. "Such ambition. Who are your people in Atlanta?" The phrasing snagged on something old and uncomfortable. "Family," Caleb said again, keeping the edges soft. "Of course." She set her empty glass on the armrest, then added in the same bright tone, "You know, I once had a nephew who thought he could just do whatever he wanted because adults kept indulging him. It didn't end well." Megan reappeared to collect the glass. "We'll be closing the door in just a moment," she said. "If anyone needs the restroom, now's a good time." Her eyes flicked from Caleb to Linda to the aisle, reading the temperature of their little microclimate. Caleb wasn't going to move. He didn't need anything. He had a good seat, a view past the wing, and enough self-control to ride out the chatter beside him. But then Linda did a curious thing. She reached to the floor and let her pen roll deliberately under the seat in front of Caleb, a tiny clatter. "Oh, dear," she said. "Would you mind?" Caleb leaned forward out of pure reflex. To be helpful was muscle memory. Then realized at once he couldn't see it. He sat back. "Sorry, I don't see it from here." "Never mind," she said, the two words placed with precision, like a card laid down in a trick. She bent, peered, reached, and in that bend, her eyes swept toward his backpack like a moth to light. She didn't touch anything, not yet, but the attention was unmistakable, a scan disguised as a search. Megan caught it too. She paused, one hand on the seat back. "Do you need me to find your pen, ma'am?" Linda straightened. "I managed," she said, a touch too quick. "Thank you." The door closed with a heavy click. The jet bridge pulled away. The safety video flickered to life on the screens. Megan and another attendant, Daniel, tall, even-keeled, with the steady bearing of someone who'd soothed every kind of travel anxiety, took their places to do the demonstrations, their movements crisp and practiced. Caleb breathed along with the announcements. He buckled his belt and tucked his tablet away for takeoff. The pilot came on. "Folks, looks like a short taxi today. We'll be in the air in no time and on our way to a beautiful afternoon in Atlanta." As the plane pushed back, Linda leaned in just enough for only him to hear. "You know, people get into trouble when they pretend to be something they're not." Caleb kept his eyes on his hands, on the little freckle near his thumb knuckle. "I'm not pretending, ma'am." "We'll see," she murmured, and faced forward, expression placid. The nose swung toward the runway, engines spooled with a deepening growl. For a small, perfect second, Caleb was only the version of himself who loved takeoffs, body pressed into the seatback, city and water and roads shrinking to a toy set, clouds like open doors. The wheels lifted, the ground fell away. New York thinned to a lace of sunlight and shadow. 10 minutes later, with the ding of the seatbelt sign, the quiet rituals of flight resumed. Megan moved down the aisle, checking on folks who needed to use the restroom, collecting trash from pre-flight service. The cabin rose into that familiar limbo, not quite Earth, not exactly destination, the odd comfort of being between. Linda dabbed the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin she'd brought from somewhere. "Megan," she said as the attendant passed, "would you mark my account for a preference of aisle seats in the future? I sometimes feel hemmed in." "Happy to note it," Megan replied, smiling with her eyes, and continued. Caleb reopened his tablet and called up a practice quiz. Lift coefficients, Bernoulli's principle, a short item set on control surfaces. He clicked through 3 questions in a row with easy confidence. The rhythm returned. It always did, when he let it. "What kind of headphones are those?" Linda asked. "They look expensive." "They were a birthday present," he said, and pulled them from their case. He didn't put them on. It felt like a line he shouldn't draw yet with how the morning had gone. Instead, he set them on the seat between them, a boundary as polite as a fence. Linda tilted her head. "I suppose parents will buy anything these days if a child asks the right way." "Not really," Caleb said, and forced a small smile to soften the words. Across the aisle, Evelyn's eyes softened. "Young man, you remind me of my graduate advisees," she said conversationally. "Head down, doing the work, even when the world insists on pestering you." Caleb huffed a tiny laugh. "I'm trying." "You're doing fine," she said. The drink cart rolled forward. Daniel took over their side of the aisle while Megan served the other. "Can I get either of you anything?" he asked, his voice a calm note in the low cabin song. "Sparkling water with lime," Caleb said. "Another champagne," Linda said. "And please make sure the bottles in the galley are properly secured. Turbulence gives me hives." Daniel's mouth twitched. "Lime for you," he told Caleb, and set it down gently. "I'll secure the galley, ma'am," he added to Linda, not unkindly, and moved on. Time stretched and softened. Caleb worked through another practice set. He texted his dad a quick "wheels up" on the in-flight Wi-Fi, then put his phone away when the notification chimed back. "Proud of you. See you soon." He could picture his dad's grin, the way his eyes crinkled, the way he always made time to meet Caleb at the end of a trip if the schedule allowed. The thought steadied him like a familiar hand at the small of his back. Linda spoke again, bright and airy. "You know, when I was your age, I would never have dreamed of speaking so little to adults. Children today are independent." He didn't say that he'd learned exactly how much silence kept him safer with strangers. He didn't owe her that lesson. Megan reached their row with a small basket of mixed nuts, napkins tucked around the bowls to keep them warm. "Snack for you?" she asked. "Yes, please," Caleb said. He accepted the bowl and a napkin, said thank you, and set them on his tray. "For me as well," Linda said. "But could I get a separate bowl? I don't like when things are mixed together." She smiled at Caleb's bowl as if it had failed her etiquette class. "Of course," Megan said, and brought a second little dish, a selection of almonds alone, at Linda's request. As Megan moved off, Linda accidentally bumped the corner of Caleb's tray. The bowl wobbled, but didn't spill. She flinched theatrically. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry. These seats are so cramped," she said, and shifted toward the aisle with more force than necessary. "They're actually pretty spacious," Caleb said before he could help himself. He kept the tone mild. Even so, he felt his pulse tick up. He took a breath and heard his mom's voice in his head again. "You never have to be smaller than you are to make someone else feel bigger, but you do get to choose the safest way to be yourself." Megan returned with a printed menu card. "Just so you can choose when we begin meal service," she said, placing one on their shared armrest. Linda took it first and scanned quickly. "Do you have anything without spices?" she asked, wrinkling her nose at the quinoa bowl description where harissa appeared. "My system is very sensitive." "We can keep it simple," Megan assured her. "Grilled chicken salad is very mild." Linda nodded, mollified. Then, as Megan turned away, Linda let out a soft sigh, pitched like a stage whisper. "I do miss when first class had more standards." Caleb decided to pretend he didn't hear. He focused on his screen again, on the clean edges of diagrams and the satisfaction of a correct answer. He let the quiet fill in around him, an invisible boundary. After a few minutes, Megan leaned in and dropped her voice. "We'll begin service in about 15 minutes, she said. If either of you wants to use the restroom, now's a good window before we start coming through with trays." "Good idea," Linda said brightly. She didn't move. Caleb reached for his cup and realized it was empty. He stood planning to toss it and wash his hands. "Excuse me," he murmured, stepping into the aisle. Evelyn offered him a small smile as he passed, encouraging without being intrusive. He hadn't taken 3 steps before Linda popped up too, as if drawn by a magnet. "I'll just stretch my legs," she announced to no one in particular, rolling her shoulders as if the cabin had conspired against her posture. She didn't follow him down the aisle, not exactly, but he could feel her attention track him all the same, a thin beam of scrutiny he'd known in stores and hallways and classrooms where he didn't quite fit someone's unspoken chart. The forward lavatory was empty. Caleb closed the door and braced his hands on the small sink. For a breath and another, he counted. In, 2, 3. Out, 2, 3, 4. The mirror showed a boy with steady eyes and a careful jaw. He washed his hands, dried them, and let his shoulders drop 1/2 inch. He wasn't going to let this become the whole story of his day. Back at his seat, he eased past Linda, who had returned to her place, posture perfect, and settled in. On his tray table, his tablet blinked awake at the touch of his finger, cheerful and obedient. "Back so soon?" Linda asked, like a neighbor who'd been timing his trip to the mailbox. "Yes, ma'am." He clicked the screen dark and slid the tablet an inch farther toward his side, not defensive, just clear. Megan returned with hot towels in little silver tongs. "Careful, they're warm," she said, placing one on each of their trays. The warmth soothed the nerves in Caleb's fingers. He wiped his hands and the little strip of wood trim along the edge of the table, as he'd watched his dad do 1,000 times, more out of habit than need. "So organized," Linda said. "Do they teach that at your school?" He smiled. "Mostly at home." She lifted her towel to her face, inhaled, and then dropped it neatly on the dish. "Megan, I do hope the captain finds a smoother altitude. I bruise easily." "We're looking for the best ride," Megan said, gracious and unfazed. She slid the cart forward. Daniel followed behind with linens, setting white cloths on each tray with a small flourish. Caleb liked the ritual, the careful economy of it, the small steps that made order in a world that so often spun. He offered his empty cup when Daniel reached their row. "Could I have another sparkling water when you get a chance?" "Absolutely," Daniel said. "With lime?" "Yes, thank you." "Of course." He moved on. Linda set her phone, face up, on the shared armrest. A photo of a seaside sunset scrolled onto the lock screen. Then her eyes drifted to Caleb's pocket, where the corner of his own phone, encased in a deep blue case, peeked out. "That model?" she asked, nodding toward it. "Lovely. My son has one. They're not cheap." "It was a gift," Caleb said, because that answer seemed to ease people for reasons he didn't fully understand. "Ah," she breathed, satisfaction curling her mouth. "A gift." Across the aisle, Evelyn's eyes sharpened just a hair. It wasn't hostile. It was the quiet scan of a scientist when data points start to pattern. "Folks," the captain said over the speaker, "we're expecting a few light bumps as we pass through some clouds, but nothing we shouldn't be able to smooth out. Flight time looks good. Should have you in Atlanta a few minutes early." The cabin lights softened a notch. Outside the window, clouds spread like a field, some flat as a tabletop, others heaped like whipped cream. Caleb stared. He had a dozen pictures of clouds on his phone. He never got tired of them. The cart returned. Daniel laid their salads down with practiced grace, glasses refilled, napkins folded into tidy rectangles. "Enjoy," he said. "Excuse me," Linda said, "but could you bring me a second set of utensils? Sometimes the forks smell metallic." She offered Daniel a prim smile, as if it were a charming quirk and not a test. "Right away," he said, and returned with a new roll-up, unfazed. Caleb ate quietly, grateful for the pause in talking. The chicken was tender, the vinaigrette bright without being bossy. He tore a corner of bread and spread butter on it, his appetite slipping back as if nothing uneasy had happened at all. Halfway through the salad, he stopped. Enough. He set his fork down and draped the napkin over his plate. He sipped water, checked the time on the overhead panel, and decided he should take a quick break before the cabin got busy again. He stood and stretched. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm going to the restroom. Do you need me to move anything?" Linda's smile flickered. "No, dear," she said, voice velvet. "I'll be just fine." Caleb nodded and stepped into the aisle, careful of knees and cups and elbows as he edged past. He missed the way Linda's fingers tightened on the armrest, the way her eyes narrowed in calculation the moment his back was to her. He missed the quick glance she shot toward the overhead bin, then down to the shadow under the seat. He missed how her breath hitched, as if she'd been waiting for a cue and thought she finally heard it. Caleb leaves for the restroom, unaware Linda's eyes follow him the whole way. Caleb had barely closed the lavatory door behind him before he felt the quiet press of the plane's hum, a sound that was different in here, muted and steady, like the ocean inside a shell. He washed his hands, ran a paper towel over them, and let himself breathe for a moment. The mirror gave him a calm, measured reflection. His mom's voice came to him again. "Sometimes the best answer is the one you give without raising your voice." When he stepped back into the aisle, the cabin lights were softer, the cloudscape sliding slowly past the windows. Daniel, the lead flight attendant, was just returning from the galley with a bottle of sparkling water for someone in row 4. Caleb moved carefully past passengers stretching their legs, then back into his seat. Linda was already there, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her expression was composed, but her eyes had the restless flicker of someone holding on to a thought they wanted to voice. "Restrooms in first class are quite small, aren't they?" she said lightly. "They're fine," Caleb replied, buckling his seatbelt. Megan appeared almost immediately, checking if everyone was settled. She offered Caleb a fresh napkin and a plate of cookies from the galley, Delta's warm, gooey kind that always came right after the meal service. He thanked her and set them beside his tablet. Linda accepted hers too, then leaned toward Megan as if sharing a friendly observation. "I'm not saying there's a problem," she began, her voice pitched to carry to Daniel a row away, "but I did notice the young man stepped away from his seat for quite some time. You might want to make sure everyone's items are where they should be, just in case." Caleb's jaw tightened. He didn't miss the way Megan's eyes flicked to his backpack in the overhead bin, then back to him, but Megan's voice stayed professional. "Of course, ma'am. We check the cabin regularly." Daniel returned a minute later, pausing at their row. "Everything all right here?" he asked, glancing between them. Linda offered a quick smile. "Oh, everything's fine. I just think it's better to be careful. You never know these days." It was Evelyn across the aisle who finally cut in, her tone calm but firm. "Careful is good. Assuming is not." She met Linda's eyes for a beat too long to be casual. Daniel cleared his throat. "If there's any concern, we can address it privately. But for now, let's keep things comfortable for all our guests." The rest of the cabin seemed to have tuned in without turning their heads. Small shifts in posture, ears angled toward the exchange. Caleb didn't say anything. He focused on breaking his cookie in half, letting the chocolate soften against his tongue. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of looking flustered. Linda took a slow sip of her champagne, as if to close the subject. But the tension didn't dissolve. It hung there, faint but unmistakable. Half an hour later, turbulence rippled through the cabin. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and Megan's voice came over the intercom asking everyone to return to their seats. Caleb felt the plane dip and then steady. He glanced out at the pale blue horizon, letting the sky pull his focus away from the unease. When the bumps eased, Daniel moved down the aisle with the passenger manifest in hand. He paused at Caleb's row, glancing at the page. his brow furrowed ever so slightly, then smoothed again. Caleb caught the moment. It was small, but it was there. "Everything good here?" Daniel asked again. "Yes," Caleb said simply. Linda added, "Perfectly fine. I just think a little vigilance never hurt anyone." Daniel's smile didn't change, but he stepped into the galley and spoke in a low tone to the gate agent via the crew phone. Caleb couldn't hear the words, but he noticed Daniel's eyes return briefly to the manifest before he hung up. The plane settled into the quiet rhythm of mid-flight. People read, napped, or scrolled through their screens. Caleb let himself relax into his seat, grateful for the stillness, but he knew something had shifted. The way Daniel had looked at the manifest, it was as if a puzzle piece had clicked into place. Evelyn caught his eye across the aisle and gave a small, reassuring nod. He returned it, feeling the knot in his chest loosen slightly. Then the calm was broken by a faint chime and the captain's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to return to the gate for a brief security matter. Please remain seated and follow the crew's instructions." A murmur ran through the cabin. Linda's eyes widened, and she turned to Caleb with a look that was part satisfaction, part vindication. "See?" she whispered. Caleb didn't answer. He watched the runway recede, the ground crew waiting as the plane taxied back toward the terminal. Whatever was coming, he knew, was about to play out in front of the whole first-class cabin. The engines wound down, the door opened, and 2 uniformed security officers stepped aboard. The low murmur in the cabin turned into a heavy silence as the security officers stepped inside. They were professional, without being theatrical. Navy uniforms neat, movements measured, expressions neutral in the way that says they've handled 100 versions of this and plan to handle 100 more. The first officer, a woman with calm eyes and a tidy bun, paused at the galley, while the second, a taller man with a clipped mustache, followed her cue. Daniel met them both at the forward bulkhead, his voice low, and gestured toward row 3. Caleb sat very still, hands visible on his knees, the way his mother had taught him. Polite stillness, not surrender. The air felt thinner somehow, even with the vents murmuring. Outside the windows, the jet bridge framed a rectangle of terminal glass and pale daylight. A few passengers shifted, the sound of leather meeting fabric punctuating the quiet. "Good afternoon," the woman officer began as they reached Caleb's row. Her tone was even, almost gentle, more customer service than confrontation. "I'm Officer Ruiz. This is Officer Blake. We've been asked to get a brief statement from a couple of passengers before departure." Caleb nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." Linda straightened as if called to the stage. "Thank goodness," she breathed. "I reported a very concerning situation." "Ma'am," Officer Ruiz said, not unkindly, "we'll speak with you as well." Daniel addressed the cabin in a calm baritone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be resolving a quick matter here at the front, and then we'll be on our way. Thank you for your patience." His voice lowered again to the officers. "Row 3. Megan appeared at Caleb's shoulder, a quiet anchor. "Sir," she said softly, using the same respectful "sir" she'd used for businessmen in suits and grandparents celebrating anniversaries, "the officers would like to step into the jet bridge with you to talk. I'll hold your seat." Caleb unbuckled his belt. "Yes, ma'am." He stood carefully and reached overhead for his backpack, then paused, deciding not to take it. He glanced at Megan. She gave the slightest shake of her head, as if to say, "You shouldn't have to carry proof of yourself to the bathroom." He left it where it was and stepped into the aisle. "Excuse me," Linda said, blocking his way for half a second with a hand on the armrest. "He should bring the bag. The bag is the problem." Evelyn's voice came from across the aisle, steady as a tuned string. "The bag is not the problem." Officer Blake, the mustache, the watchful eyes, positioned himself a step back, letting Officer Ruiz keep the lead. "Sir, if you'll come with us," she said to Caleb, "we'll make this quick." He nodded and moved forward. The cabin seemed to expand behind him, a valley of attention as he walked the few feet to the door. He was aware of everything. The soft thud of his sneakers on the carpet, the scuff on the edge of the bulkhead. Megan's hand briefly brushing the seat back in a small, private gesture of encouragement. He didn't look at Linda as he passed, though he could feel her gaze on the side of his face like sun that hadn't earned the right to warm him. Out in the jet bridge, the air changed, cooler, faintly metallic. Officer Ruiz shifted so they were out of the doorway, giving the cabin a semblance of privacy and the officers a little space to work. A gate agent hovered a few feet away, headset around his neck, doing that blend of helpful and invisible airline staff get so good at. "Mr. Johnson," Officer Ruiz said, checking the manifest Daniel had handed over, "can you tell me in your own words what happened?" Caleb spoke calmly, hands at his sides. He didn't add flourishes or commentary. He described boarding, the seat check, the comments, the pen that rolled, the way Linda had leaned down and peered under the seat. "When I went to the restroom and came back," he said, "she was watching me like she was waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Nothing has." Officer Ruiz nodded as she took it in, pen moving over her small notebook. "Do you have a phone or tablet with you today that someone might have mistaken for theirs?" "I have my tablet," he said. "In my backpack. It's mine." He swallowed once. "I can unlock it and show you my name on the home screen." Blake's gaze was steady. "We might ask you to do that in a moment. For now, thank you." The gate agent, a young man with a quick, kind face, angled closer. "We're just going to keep this on the jet bridge," he said quietly, like someone easing a heavy tray onto a stable table. "We'd like to minimize disruption for everyone on board." Caleb nodded. He thought about the eyes in the cabin, the glances, the way moments like this stretched impressions into stories that some people would tell about him later, accurate or not. Inside the cabin, Linda had begun to supply her own narration. "Officers," she called, leaning into the doorway without standing. "I'm just saying I saw unusual behavior. That's all." He was reaching, and there were items. "Ma'am," Daniel said, placing a gentle and immovable palm on the seat back in front of her. "We'll ask you for your statement next." Megan had stayed near Caleb's vacated seat, as promised. She glanced toward the overhead bin, then back to Daniel. He read the look and flicked his eyes toward the latches. She checked them, then rested her hand on the bin above Caleb's row, a literal soft hold. "Mr. Johnson," Officer Ruiz continued on the jet bridge, "do you have anything you'd like to add?" He thought of his mother's phrasing, the one she'd given him for times like this. "Just that I'm trying to get home for spring break," he said, voice even. "I'm not bothering anyone. I've done nothing wrong." "Understood." Ruiz's expression didn't change, but something gentle passed behind her eyes. She looked toward the doorway. "Ma'am," she called, "we'll hear from you now." Linda stood, smoothing her blazer, and stepped to the threshold. She didn't come all the way into the jet bridge. She positioned herself just inside the door, perhaps so the audience behind her would remain in range. Her smile was bright in the way a camera flash is bright, startling more than warm. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," she began, which is what people often say when they are, in fact, causing trouble. "It's just that I noticed the young man had several high-end devices, very high-end, actually, and he kept checking them and moving around, and I worried about safety." Her eyes flicked to Caleb's hoodie, then back to the officers. "We all read the news. What specific behavior made you feel unsafe?" Ruiz asked, tone steady, pen ready. "Well," Linda said, floundering for a moment on the word specific, "he was furtive. Into his bag, then out, then into his bag again." Caleb kept his face arranged, the way his dad called it, present but not inviting argument. He didn't look down. He didn't look away. "Thank you, ma'am," Ruiz said. "We'll take it from here." Linda glanced past the officers toward the gate windows, where reflections of the cabin angled like overlapping photos. "I just think first class used to have standards," she added, too softly to be official, and yet loudly enough to be heard. "That's all." Evelyn, still seated in 3C, caught the fragment and exhaled through her nose, a sound of tempered patience. She looked at her hands for a beat, then lifted her chin and turned her face toward the window, giving the moment nowhere else to go. Ruiz and Blake conferred quietly. Then the taller officer gestured to Daniel. The lead attendant leaned in. There was a small exchange, only a handful of words, but it changed the shape of Daniel's expression just a degree. He looked at the manifest once more, then at the door, then back to the page, connecting dots that had been there all along. "Mr. Johnson," Officer Blake said, "would you mind unlocking your tablet here briefly? Then, if all looks in order, we'll return you to your seat and proceed." "Yes, sir." Caleb stepped back into the cabin, just far enough to reach the overhead bin. The latch clicked. He pulled his backpack down, unzipped it, and took out the tablet with careful hands, turning it so both officers could see. He pressed his thumb to the corner. The screen bloomed with color. The home page appeared. His name, a photo he'd taken with his parents on a Sunday walk by the Beltline, his school schedule widget tucked in the corner. It was ordinary and irrefutable. "Thank you," Blake said, the two words carrying quiet weight. He looked at Ruiz, who wrote a final note, then closed her pad. "This is sufficient for us," she said. "We're going to ask that everyone return to their seats and remain courteous for the duration of the flight. We'll have no more accusations in the cabin." Linda opened her mouth as if to object, then closed it when she saw Ruiz's face. Not hard exactly, but set in a way that said not one step further. Daniel exhaled so softly, only Megan, closest to him, seemed to hear it. He leaned toward the gate agent at the doorway. "Moment," he asked, and the agent stepped in. In that brief pause, the entire cabin recalibrated. Conversations that had stalled resumed at a lower volume. The gentleman in 4D adjusted his newspaper. Someone coughed. A zipper whispered open and shut. Small, human sounds. The machine of the moment, idling but not stalled. "Sir," Megan said to Caleb, "let me put that back up for you." He allowed it, grateful for the simple kindness embedded in routine. She stowed the backpack, touched the latch, and kept her hand there for a breath as if to say, "I've got you." He sat, buckled, and arranged his napkin over his knees, fingers steepled lightly on top. Evelyn leaned slightly toward the aisle, catching Caleb's eye. "You handled that well," she said, and then, to no one in particular, "We all appreciate efficiency." Linda returned to her seat, posture meticulous. Her jaw worked once before she smoothed her expression into something nearly pleasant. She lifted her glass and found it empty, set it down again, and folded her hands as if to demonstrate patience to the room. Officer Ruiz stepped back into the jet bridge. "We'll submit a brief note," she told Daniel. "From our perspective, you can proceed." She looked toward Caleb. "Thank you for your cooperation, sir." "Thank you," he said. The words tasted like something he'd earned, and also something he shouldn't have had to spend. The officers moved off the jet bridge, their footsteps receding. The gate agent lingered, checking with Daniel about paperwork, headset back around his neck now, ready to reconnect them to the clock the airline kept for every plane on the ground. Daniel glanced once more at the manifest. His eyes landed on a line near the top, a name that had been printed there as a courtesy more than a necessity, a note that certain passengers might be greeted by name, that certain families had travel profiles, that sometimes, not often, a crew should be aware of context beyond the seat map. He looked up at Caleb and, as if a camera had come into focus, saw what he should have seen earlier. He'd been doing this long enough to recognize the tilt of a day when it was about to become either a story people traded later or a moment handled so cleanly it never needed to be told. He didn't plan to let it be the former. "Folks," he called to the cabin with warm authority, "we'll be closing the door shortly and heading out. Once we're airborne, we'll resume service. In the meantime, thank you for your patience and courtesy." Megan began a soft sweep of the aisle, checking belts, straightening a stray strap, answering a whispered question about connections. She reached Linda's row and paused just long enough to anchor her presence there. Polite, immovable, not a guard exactly, but a boundary. Linda lifted her chin a degree. "I assume the airline takes passenger concerns seriously," she said under her breath. "We take safety and respect seriously," Megan replied, equally quiet. A beat passed. Linda looked away. The gate agent signaled he was ready to step off. Daniel nodded, then leaned back into the galley and picked up the crew phone, the internal line that ran not just to the cockpit, but to the gate desk, the station manager, the network of people who could smooth a wrinkle or flag a storm. He didn't make a show of it. That wasn't his style. He turned slightly, angled so his voice wouldn't carry, and spoke in a level tone that matched the rest of his day. He gave the flight number. He gave the row. He gave a name on the manifest that was less about status than about clarity. Then, very quietly, he said into the receiver, "Bring in the VIP guests immediately." The call Daniel placed was so calm that most of the cabin didn't notice anything had shifted. But Megan did. She caught the faint lift of his eyebrows when he hung up and the almost imperceptible nod he gave toward the jet bridge. A minute later, movement flickered beyond the open door. Two figures stepped into view, well-dressed, composed, and radiating the kind of presence that made even seasoned airport staff straighten. Richard Johnson wore a tailored Navy suit that fit like it had been made for him, because it had. His tie was a deep burgundy, knotted perfectly. Beside him, Alicia Johnson was the picture of quiet authority in a cream silk blouse and slate gray blazer. They carried nothing but a slim leather briefcase and a small tote. People whose luggage traveled separately because their schedules demanded it. Daniel moved forward to greet them. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," he said, voice warm but now edged with a note of formality. "Welcome aboard. We appreciate your patience." Richard's handshake was firm. "We were told our son might need us sooner than expected." Alicia's eyes found Caleb immediately. She didn't rush, didn't call out, but the relief in her face softened every line. "Hey, baby," she said as she reached his row. "You doing okay?" Caleb's shoulders loosened as if someone had quietly untied a knot between his shoulder blades. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Linda blinked at them, clearly recalculating. "Oh, you're his parents?" Richard turned to her with a polite but puzzled look, as if she had commented on the weather in a language he didn't speak. "Yes. Is there a reason that's surprising?" Linda opened her mouth, then shut it again, the gears behind her eyes spinning. Alicia glanced at Megan and Daniel. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding." As Megan's reply was careful but clear. "We had a passenger express concerns. We've addressed them." Richard's gaze shifted to Daniel. "And now we move on?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, sir." Evelyn across the aisle was watching with the faintest smile, like someone recognizing the resolution to a complex equation. Richard turned back to Caleb. "Why don't we get you comfortable again?" His voice was casual, but the undercurrent was unmistakable, a father's protective gravity. Caleb slid back into his seat. Alicia rested a hand lightly on his shoulder for a moment before taking the aisle seat behind him, leaving Richard in the row just across. It was a subtle rearrangement, but the message was clear. The boy was not alone. Linda adjusted her scarf, the diamond studs in her ears catching the overhead light. "Well," she said, "I was just—" Alicia's tone was velvet over steel. "You were just making assumptions about a child you didn't know." She didn't raise her voice, but the words landed with precision. For a beat, Linda said nothing. Then she smiled thinly. It was a safety concern. Richard's brow lifted slightly. Safety isn't served by suspicion without cause. It's served by truth. The jet bridge pulled away, the door sealed, and the captain's voice came over the PA, cheerfully announcing a new departure time. As the plane began to push back, Megan moved through the cabin with the poise of someone restoring equilibrium. She offered drinks again. Caleb accepted another sparkling water. Richard and Alicia declined, preferring to keep their attention where it was needed. Linda kept her gaze on the window, but her posture had changed, straighter, tighter, as if the seat belt across her lap had been cinched one notch too far. Half an hour into the flight, Megan returned with the dessert cart. "Cheesecake or ice cream?" she asked their row. "Ice cream," Caleb said. "Same," Alicia added from behind him. Linda hesitated, then said, "Cheesecake, please," her voice softer than before. When Megan set down Caleb's dish, she also placed a small envelope on his tray. "From the captain," she said quietly. Inside was a handwritten note. "We're glad you're here. Have a safe trip home." Caleb tucked it into his backpack, not for proof, but because it felt like something worth keeping. As the lights dimmed for the evening portion of the flight, Richard leaned slightly across the aisle toward Linda, not enough to invade her space, but enough that she could hear him over the hum of the engines. "I hope the rest of your trip is more pleasant," he said. It was the kind of sentence that could be kindness or warning, depending on the listener. Linda gave a polite nod, but her eyes stayed fixed on the seat back ahead of her. Evelyn caught Caleb's gaze one last time. "You handled yourself with dignity," she said. "That matters." He smiled faintly. "Thank you." The rest of the flight passed without incident, and when the wheels touched down in Atlanta, Caleb felt something he hadn't expected. Not just relief, but a quiet certainty that the truth had been seen and heard, and that, for once, it had been enough. As the plane taxied away from the gate, Caleb looked out at the runway, the weight of the last hour settling in. For a few beats, he watched the lights along the tarmac flick past, like beads on a string, each one slipping away behind the wing. There was something steadying about the ritual of departure, the small lean into the seat back, the gentle hum underfoot, the sense of being carried. He'd felt that same steadiness earlier when Alicia's hand rested on his shoulder, and Richard's voice found its even register, calm as a lighthouse. Now that steadiness returned, not as a shield, but as a breath he could finally take all the way in. He wasn't sure when he fell asleep, sometime after dessert, sometime after Evelyn's warm, "You handled yourself with dignity," sometime after Megan slipped the captain's note onto his tray. When the wheels touched down in Atlanta, his ears popped, and he blinked awake to the soft applause from a few rows back, and the half-smile on his father's face. The landing was smooth, the taxi unhurried, and the door opened onto a late-afternoon sun that made the jet bridge glow like it had its own weather. The walk through Hartsfield-Jackson felt familiar. Moving sidewalks, murals, the faint smell of barbecue escaping a food court, announcements pinging politely from the ceiling. Richard kept an easy pace at Caleb's side. Alicia fell in just behind, a finger hooked lightly through the tote strap on her shoulder, as if she were resisting the impulse to loop the arm around her son and tuck him close. They didn't talk much at first. After a long, noisy hour that had demanded poise from everyone, the quiet felt like balm. A station manager met them at the end of the concourse, button-down shirt, tie loosened a notch, competent smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, welcome," he said. "We've arranged a space in the Sky Club if you'd like a moment before heading out." "That would be great," Alicia said, and Caleb heard the small fatigue that had slipped into her voice, only now that the door was closed on the plane and all the eyes were somewhere else. The Sky Club was hushed and bright. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced the field, where planes pushed, parked, pivoted. The coffee machines purred. An attendant in a navy vest moved along a counter setting out mini peach pies next to a little card that read, "Welcome to Atlanta." It would have been a nice scene on any other day. It was a nice scene now. Nice could still count. Patricia Lee was already waiting near a pair of armchairs. She stood when she saw them, smoothing her blazer with a motion that looked more like grounding than fuss. "Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Johnson, Caleb." She said his name like she meant it, not like an introduction or a headline. "I'm truly sorry for what happened today." Richard shook her hand. "Thank you for making the time." Patricia's expression held a mix of firmness and regret. "We want to make this right," she said. "Not just for you, for everyone who may find themselves in a similar position with less support." Caleb sat, the leather cool against his back, and reached for a glass of water from the small table. He wasn't sure what to do with his hands. He folded them, then unfolded them, then finally just let them rest on his knees. Alicia took the seat beside him and set her tote at her feet the way she always did, squared to a corner as if the geometry itself could be a comfort. "There are a few things we're going to do immediately," Patricia continued. "Additional training is the headline, but it can't be the whole story. We're reviewing our incident escalation procedures, who gets called when, how we frame concerns versus accusations, and how we anchor the presumption of good faith for every passenger. We'll publish that review, not tuck it in a drawer. I'd like your input on that process if you're willing." Richard nodded. "You'll have it," he said. He didn't say "I expect it" or "I require it." He didn't need to. The way he agreed made it clear that partnership, to him, was a form of insistence. Alicia held Patricia's gaze. "And the boy at the center of today," she said gently. "I want whatever we do to honor the fact that Caleb is 15. He shouldn't become a mascot for anyone's messaging." "I agree," Patricia said immediately. "The statement won't name him. The changes won't use him as a symbol." She looked to Caleb. "But if there's anything you want to say, we'll hear it." He thought about that. There was a stretchy feeling inside his chest, part tired, part full. "I don't want anyone to get humiliated," he said slowly. "I mean, if someone needs to be held accountable, okay, but humiliation doesn't teach the right thing." Alicia's eyes softened. Richard's mouth tipped at one corner. Patricia exhaled through her nose, like someone accepting a nudge they had been hoping for. "We can build that principle into the work," she said. They talked logistics for a few minutes. Patricia outlined a timeline, an immediate internal bulletin to all stations, a 2-week sprint to update the crew handbook, 30 days for a third-party audit of bias-related incidents. She asked if Alicia would review the language on passenger recording policies as they related to minors. Alicia agreed. She made a note in her phone, thumb moving briskly, but without hurry. The conversation turned to the smaller human gestures that, in the end, mattered as much as policy. Patricia promised follow-up coaching for the crew, not because they'd failed, but because they'd been trapped in the gray space between customer service and conflict, and they deserved more tools than good intentions and poise. She promised handwritten notes from the captain to Caleb's parents and to Evelyn, thanking her for steady witness. "She steadied the room," Patricia said simply. "We should say so." Caleb didn't know exactly how to hold gratitude and sadness at the same time, but he guessed this was the shape of it. He pictured Evelyn's wire-rimmed glasses and the way her voice never needed to get loud to land. He pictured Megan's hand resting on the overhead bin, the way the crew folded order back into the space one soft step at a time. He pictured Linda's face as it went from certainty to confusion to the tight, fixed expression of someone who had suddenly discovered their story wasn't the only one in the room. "What happens to her?" he asked, not entirely sure why he wanted to know. Patricia's reply was plain. "She's been removed from that flight. Our security team will complete a report. We'll review her account in our system. If she flies with us again, it would be after she completes a program we're building in consultation with outside experts, not a checkbox, something with teeth and heart." Alicia tilted her head. "Teeth and heart," she repeated. "Good order." Richard glanced at his watch and then at Caleb. "How are you feeling?" he asked. It wasn't the sort of question adults always asked boys in public spaces. It sounded like a question asked at a kitchen table or in a car at a red light. "Tired," Caleb said. "Okay. Hungry again," he added, and the way Alicia's shoulders dropped a fraction told him it was the right answer. The regular answer, the kind of answer that meant today was still a day, not a legend. "Let me get you something," she said, and stood to scan the buffet. Chicken salad, fruit, a bowl of cheddar popcorn that smelled, improbably, like childhood afternoons. She came back with a little plate and a plastic spoon because the regular spoons were gone, and they smiled about it like people do when a small imperfection makes the scene more human. The three of them lingered in the lounge for another half hour. Patricia excused herself for a call with the station chiefs. The attendant in the navy vest brought a plate of those mini pies and set it down with a wink. "Welcome home," she said. The sun slid a degree lower on the glass as a 737 rolled into a gate, its nose casting a soft shadow that looked exactly like the rounded tip of a pencil. Caleb took a picture of it without thinking. He'd probably delete it later. Or maybe he wouldn't. When they finally gathered their things, Richard put a light hand at the center of Caleb's back, right where you'd steady a person going down a narrow stair. The gesture felt like habit and promise. The arrivals hall felt like every arrivals hall ever. Families waiting with flowers or cardboard signs, airport employees moving briskly with purpose, a saxophonist at the far end bending a song into something round and warm. Outside, the Georgia air was softer than New York's, scented faintly with pine and asphalt warmed all day. The driver waved, the SUV door opened, and the leather seats released that whisper of expensive soap. As they pulled away from the curb, Alicia's phone buzzed twice in quick succession. She glanced down and then made a face that wasn't quite a frown. "It's already on social," she said quietly. Someone in 4D posted a thread. She scrolled. Mostly supportive. Mostly. Caleb let his head rest on the headrest and watched the terminal recede, the tail fins lined up like flags from a country he knew by heart. He tried to imagine strangers tapping out opinions on their couches, in their kitchens, on trains, about a flight they didn't take, a boy they didn't know. The thought made his stomach do a small flip, equal parts queasy and weirdly distant. "I don't want this to become my whole thing," he said. "It won't," Richard replied. "It can be a thing, not the thing." Alicia reached over the console, her hand searching for his. He took it for a second, squeezed, then let go so she could feel the next buzz. The driver merged onto I-85, the skyline a low blue sketch ahead. At home, their house exhaled the way houses do when people return. Lights on, air cooler, the faint clatter as someone in the kitchen cleared a glass from the counter. Caleb climbed the stairs to his room, dropped his backpack by the desk, and glanced at the model airplane on his shelf. He picked it up and then set it back, not because he didn't want it, but because it belonged to the hour before dinner. Not this one. Downstairs, voices hummed. Richard on the phone with Patricia. Alicia in the dining room drafting 2 paragraphs that might just keep future kids from being cornered by someone else's concern. When she asked him to read them later, he would, and he would say, "It sounds like you," which was the highest compliment in their family when the topic was hard. Dinner was easy. Rotisserie chicken, a bowl of green beans, cornbread from the freezer warmed until the butter sank in. They ate like people who had done a big thing and now needed a small one. After, Richard insisted on washing the dishes even though the dishwasher was right there, even though they always used the dishwasher. He stood at the sink with the sleeves of his shirt rolled up and the water hot, and he looked content in a way that made Caleb's throat tighten and then relax. Later, when the kitchen settled and the house grew quiet, the 3 of them moved to the living room. The homework that wasn't urgent could wait. The shows that didn't matter could be watched another night. They sat with their feet up and talked in the way families sometimes only talk after something sharp has passed, softly, frankly, with pockets of silence that weren't awkward. Richard told a story about his first commercial flight as a young analyst, how he'd read the safety card like a prayer and the prospectus like a love letter. Alicia told a different story about a courthouse hallway and a judge who had learned something that day, not because she'd been loud, but because she'd been clear. Caleb listened, the way kids learn a map they'll draw later without looking. When the doorbell rang, they all glanced toward it with the synchronized surprise of people who weren't expecting anyone. Richard stood. Alicia followed, and Caleb, because he was curious and because curiosity was one of the family languages, padded after them. A courier stood on the porch with a small envelope. "Evening," he said. "Delivery from the airport station." Richard signed. Inside was a single page on letterhead and a note in neat cursive. The letterhead belonged to the airline. The note belonged to the captain. "Thank you for your patience and grace today. We owe you more than a smooth flight. We owe you our attention. We'll be working on that tomorrow." Under it, another line, smaller, almost an afterthought, but not, Tell Caleb I hope he keeps looking out the window. That's where the good thinking starts. Caleb read it twice and then once more. He didn't know what to do with the feeling that rose and settled. He folded the note carefully and set it on his desk upstairs next to the model plane. He didn't take a picture. Not everything needed a second copy. By the next morning, the first emails had gone out and the first calls had been scheduled. The story was already busy being itself out in the world. But inside their house, the morning looked like any other Saturday. Caleb poured cereal and sliced a banana and watched the steam from Alicia's coffee curl into the air like script. Richard read the headlines and then pushed them away, choosing to study the crossword instead. The dog, who hadn't been featured in any of the day's drama and didn't know why anyone was acting like the living room needed to be so profound, thumped his tail against the couch and licked Caleb's wrist until he laughed out loud for the first time since the landing. Patricia called at 10. Evelyn emailed at 10:30 with an old article about a NASA engineer whose problem had once seemed impossible until it wasn't. At noon, the station manager texted a photo of the crew debrief. Anonymous faces around a table, coffee cups and highlighters, and the kind of tired that means a job mattered. In the afternoon, Caleb met two friends at the matinee. The theater was mostly empty. The movie was fine. He ate popcorn with too much butter and exactly the right amount of salt. When his phone buzzed during the previews, he ignored it. He'd answer people later. He'd answer some of them, not at all. The seat was soft, the room dark, the laughter easy. He let his shoulders release another inch. That evening, as dusk made the neighborhood soft, Alicia and Richard sat on the back steps while Caleb shot hoops in the driveway. The ball thudded a steady beat. Tap, tap, lift, net. A breeze moved through the crepe myrtles like a whispered yes. From somewhere 2 streets over, music drifted, a radio tuned to an old soul song that held inside it everything they loved about this city. Richard watched one more shot arc cleanly through the rim. "You good?" he called. Caleb bounced the ball once more and caught it at his hip. "Yeah," he said. He meant it. He put the ball down, crossed the yard, and flopped onto the step beside them. For a while, no one said anything. They didn't need to. The day had narrowed into evening, and evening was doing that thing it does when a home is full, the air warm enough to sit outside without thinking about it, the sky deciding whether to keep a little lavender or go all the way to blue-black. Alicia reached for Caleb's hand and squeezed. "You were brave," she said. "I was just me," he answered. "That's the bravest thing," Richard said. Inside, the kitchen timer beeped for no good reason. Someone had leaned on a button and set it to 3 minutes an hour ago. Alicia laughed and stood to switch it off. The world had a way of reminding you it wasn't only about the big moments. Before bed, Caleb opened the blinds in his room and looked out at the street. A porch light across the way blinked on. A cat made a decision about a fence and then made another one. Somewhere, a plane drew a quiet line across the sky and disappeared into whatever came next. He didn't rehearse comebacks he hadn't said or replay the worst seconds in his head. He did not draft testaments or manifestos. He brushed his teeth. He set his alarm. He balanced the little captain's note on top of his science binder so he wouldn't lose it among the worksheets and the to-dos. And because the day had started with a runway and a thought about dignity, he decided to end it with something simpler than either. Caleb smiles at the thought of heading home, knowing some changes take root quietly. Sometimes the biggest change starts in the quiet after the storm. For Caleb, the flight to Atlanta could have been remembered only for a stranger's suspicion. Instead, it became a reminder that the way you carry yourself, calm, clear, and steady, can shape how people see the truth. His parents knew that one incident didn't define their son, but they also knew it was part of a larger story, one the Black community has been telling for generations. The need to move through the world with both dignity and awareness, even when that world doesn't always return the favor. They didn't frame it as fear, they framed it as preparation. The airline's promise to review its procedures wasn't just corporate housekeeping. It was a small but real acknowledgement that the concerns of the Black community about fairness, respect, and the benefit of the doubt are not optional extras. They are the baseline for trust. Caleb's calm was part of that message, but so was the quiet firmness of the people who stood beside him. In the weeks that followed, Caleb went back to being a regular kid, school, friends, basketball in the driveway. But somewhere in that normal rhythm was a deeper understanding. You don't always get to choose the test, but you can choose the answer. And every time the answer is grounded in truth and self-respect, it sends a signal that can ripple far beyond you. That's how change starts. One person, one moment, one choice, until the whole Black community can feel the difference.